Hi everyone, welcome to the Organising in COVID event at Edinburgh Anarchist Feminist Book Fair 2021. If you're joining us for the first time, please take a moment to look over our Safer Spaces agreement, which is available to read on our website. I'll post a link in the chat just now. On the website, you can also check out the book fair stalls and the full programme for the weekend. As ever, the book fair is made possible by people giving their generous time and labour. All donations this year go directly to the speakers and organisations taking part, so if you can, please consider donating via our PayPal. Again, I'll drop the link in the chat. We're always keen to hear feedback about how we can improve the book fair next year and make our programming and our spaces more accessible. If you have thoughts you'd like to share after the event, please drop us a line via the feedback page on the website. So thanks for coming, everyone, and we'll get started. So first, I'd like to kind of hand it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, just to pick on someone. Meg, would you like to tell us a bit about Living Rent?
Sure, so thank you and hi everyone. I'm Meg and I'm from Living Rent, which is Scotland's tenants union, and we're a democratic organisation run by and for tenants. And what we aim to do is tackle the power imbalances that exist between landlords and those of us who don't have control of our housing situation. Typically this takes the form of member defence and supporting one another through disputes of our landlords, but also through various campaigns such as for rent controls and mostly through direct action. I'll leave it there to keep it brief. Thank you.
Eddie, would you like to introduce Mate?
Yeah, I seem to have a bit of an insecure connection. Can people hear me? Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
We can hear you. So Mate is...
Okay.
Are you all right, Eddie, or would you like me to step in?
I think I'm back, sorry. Yes, so I'm Eddie and I'm here with Nim, and we organise with MATE, which is Mutual Aid Trans Edinburgh. So we formed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, so way back in, I think our first meeting was in March of 2020. And so we respond to external and internal requests for help and support, covering things like food insecurity, isolation, navigating benefit systems, trans healthcare, and fundraising for things like housing costs as well. And I think, Nim, did you want to talk a little bit about how we organize very, very quickly as well?
I beg your pardon? How we organise? Yeah, so our principles are around being everything is freely given and shared, and we can't guarantee to meet any requests, and we're very much looking at trying to support ourselves and each other through quite tricky times, and acknowledging that it's difficult for everyone, and seeing what we can do. And apologies, I'm struggling with connections as well. So sorry, you can't see my face.
It's okay, no worries. Thank you for your introductions. Gemma, would you like to tell us a bit about the IWW?
Yeah, thanks very much for having us here. Yeah, so I'm Gemma, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. The IWW is a labour union that focuses on three key principles: solidarity, direct action, and democracy. And we've been around for quite some time. You know, there was a historical union that was set up in 1905, but the current kind of iteration of the union's been around for about 20 years or so. We're based kind of not just in the UK, but Ireland as well, and other countries across the world, particularly in North America too. Yeah, and I'm very glad to be here.
Thanks, Gemma. So to jump right in, got our first question, which is what have organising conditions been like during the pandemic? Could you give us some background about the common struggles your organisations have been encountering? If it's all right with everyone, if we go in the same order, pick on Living Rent first. Either Meg or Keita would like to speak on that.
Sure, I can start us off and then Kita can talk more about her experience of member defence as well. So one of the things that we found quite challenging, obviously we're a working class organisation with a primary tactic of direct action, and it's really hard to do that online. Certainly it's changed the way that we have to organise, and we also are very conscious of the digital divide. As much as the internet is saturated so much of our everyday life, it's still not everyone has access to it equally, and that does make it more challenging to commit to endless Zoom meetings, and also that can then contribute to burnout as well if you're spending so much time behind a screen trying to organise. Certainly I think it's challenged keeping up interest and morale as well. One of the things I think that's really important for organising is the social time that you spend with your fellow members and your comrades, and not being able to do that and go for a coffee after a meeting certainly means that it's been more challenging to build up trust, because you don't have that space outside of that or being behind the screen. But that doesn't mean that it's all been negative for us. So Kita is joined more recently and so has been experiencing pretty much living rent online from the get-go. So I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Sure, yeah. So obviously the pandemic has exacerbated an already bad housing situation in Edinburgh, but despite of all the challenges of organising virtually, we've actually managed to triple our membership, which is amazing. And the urgency of the housing situation has brought housing and tenants' rights into people's consciousness a little bit more because of things like people being evicted during a pandemic. And so we have been pushed to improve the way the union functions and to take into account accessibility when organising online. But obviously we've still got a lot to learn, sort of how to stay accountable to our members and be aware of the work we will take on when politicians behave like everything is back to normal. And while the housing situation kind of remains the same or gets even worse.
Thanks for that. Eddie or Nim, would you like to tell us a bit about what this year's been like for Mate?
Yeah, so obviously we did get started because of the pandemic, so there's not really a comparison for us in terms of like how things have changed. But I guess echoing a little bit about what Kita said about the housing situation already being quite difficult in Edinburgh, I think what the pandemic has really done is brought into really sharp relief the inequalities and various divisions and oppressions that were already in place and were already impacting particularly vulnerable groups. And obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, but queer and trans people tend to face those things disproportionately, things like homelessness, things like poor mental health. There's obviously difficulties around accessing trans healthcare within a meaningful time frame and getting the support around that. So that's part of why we chose to organize around this specific demographic, if you like, was to increase sort of resilience within our community. And I think we were expecting to have to do a lot more. So a lot of the early things that we were expecting to do was like, if you're self-isolating and you need someone to pick up your prescription or do your shopping for you, like those sorts of tasks. But as things have continued, a lot of the areas where we're providing support and where we're receiving support, because again, we are a mutual aid group, we're not a service provider, have been things that are more long-standing and speak to sort of like a deeper level of need that we anticipate will continue beyond going back to normal, whatever that looks like. Yeah, Nim, did you want to come in there on anything?
Just also that this year with COVID, there's been a shift in political rhetoric, I think generally more towards victim blaming and harsher things. There's been a huge uptick in trans misogyny, particularly like Eddie was saying, those divisions are getting sharper, and it's really exacerbating this year. That was all I wanted to say.
Thank you for that. Gemma?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's been a really interesting kind of, I guess, like to say the least, from an organizational point of view, last like 15 months or so. A lot of which I think Meg and Meg mentioned, like a lot of aspects of union building is about building trust with people, and sort of like working with other people, like often on a one-to-one basis before it becomes like kind of a collective kind of like grievance challenge process or whatever within a workplace. And that's been particularly difficult, partly because like, you know, from an IWW organizer perspective, meeting with people has like kind of not been an option, like, you know, like over the last like sort of 15 months or so. So we've had to kind of rely a lot on phone calls and on internet and on emails and things, and that's been quite challenging, because, you know, I think you know, to build trust, you need that human connection a lot of the time, and that's quite difficult to maintain and sort of manage, I guess, online. For a lot of our members as well, you know, the last 15 months have been extremely difficult, like really unpredictable. We suddenly saw kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, like vast proportions of our membership just become furloughed overnight. And so they lost their jobs effectively and became even more precarious. Often people who were in workplaces like hospitality, the hotel, restaurant, or tourism industries, just basically like became unemployed overnight effectively. And were often waiting for the government to sort of like confirm whether they were going to have money for the next 4 months, a week or two before that deadline was supposed to appear. So a lot of stress was happening with our membership. So yeah, like we've managed to kind of I guess recently, like kind of like sort of like get back out there a little bit more and sort of like talking with more people as the lockdowns kind of started to ease. And we've had a lot more interest in sort of our training programs. But like, you know, like shifting an entire organization online, like in the space of like a month or two has been, that was very challenging to begin with. And now it's kind of become a bit commonplace and a bit easier now. But, you know, that was quite a significant barrier to traverse, I guess, at the beginning.
Thanks for that. I'd like to open up the discussion to kind of reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned from organising in the last year, such as failures, successes, and opportunities going forward. And kind of based on what people were saying before, just to kind of give us a bit of a prompt to go off. We're talking a lot about, like, you know, kind of building trust and how difficult that's become online. And I suppose as a question, how can we expand grassroots organisations like yourselves, and what have you found has been useful in extending mutual aid and union networks outside of our own bubbles when, you know, modern life and particularly the pandemic is making us more and more isolated? If someone from Living Rent would like to go first, if people are okay to keep the same order, just for ease.
Yeah, for sure. So with mutual aid, obviously it is made more difficult. For a lot of the time we couldn't do street stalls, which is a really good way to sort of reach out to the community and connect with people and ask how their situation is and stuff. And so without being able to do that, our replacement was phone banking, which did work, but honestly the best way we could grow our membership and connect with the community was supporting one another through member defense, because during the pandemic a lot of people needed a supportive network to challenge the situations they were in. So the solidarity built through fighting for the rights of fellow tenants is rewarding for everyone and helps to grow the union as well. It's empowering because it teaches members that they can change their situation and they don't have to just accept it. And we can also make a difficult situation less painful, because, you know, we're working together and having fun, and especially campaign work can be quite tongue-in-cheek, and it makes it a bit less intimidating for people to be involved in. And so organizing in this way helps to build solidarity and connections and sort of bridging all differences and bringing the community together, because simply not being in control of your housing situation is what brings our members together. And obviously there's still a lot of work to be done, and sort of making sure that our understanding of housing is intersectional and that everyone is being represented is important as well.
Great. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Meg?
I think Keita covered it really nicely there, and I definitely think that especially when we have been so isolated, when we've been locked in our flats, if we've been fortunate enough to have a roof over our head during the pandemic, so it has been a really isolating experience. And this is sort of compounded by the fact in the years before the pandemic, sort of traditional labour relations broke down. There was more and more divisions within our communities as well. So organising around our housing situation is something that connects everyone. And it's been able to, even when we're so divided and physically locked in our rooms, it does connect you to your street and your block and your neighborhood and your community. And I think that's what's been really useful for us. And that's not changed regardless of the pandemic. If anything, it feels more important now, and there's more of a precedent about the right to decent, affordable housing, or it's more on the public mind.
Thanks for that. Eddie, would you like to tell us a bit about how MATE has kind of overcome these kind of obstacles?
Yeah, I think talking about trust and facilitating that is an interesting one, because it's something that, like, Nim and I, for example, have had a lot of conversations around. And I think to take the second part of your question about like expanding, so that's something that's a little bit different for us, because we're not a campaign group, we're not a union, we're not leveraging power in that way. I wouldn't say that we're not like amassing political power, because I think that's we are, and also I think that's being naive about like what mutual aid can and should do. But I think that sort of like impulse, like so we have to kind of constantly remind ourselves to like look at things from a sort of non-hierarchical anti-capitalist perspective. Like when we decide to do something or put in a procedure in place or like reach out in a certain way, like we need to be really clear about why we're doing that. And I think coming back to like the core thing of like we're trying to build community and build trust, and foster resilience as a community. So expansion in and of itself is not necessarily a goal for us. I think more of a challenge has been around how, so we're quite porous in our membership, and people's capacity like ebbs and flows, and it's sort of how do we continue to have sort of a coherent sort of community direction, if you like, without like falling into sort of like institutionalization, and how do we empower people to be autonomous actors within this community without accidentally fostering hierarchies of power. And part of that is also being aware of like whose voices are being heard the most, whose voices aren't present at all, and that can be difficult to challenge when everything's online as well. And I think Keita was talking about like when you can't organize together, like there, or maybe it was Meg, I'm not sure. One of the Living Rent people mentioned, that lack of like that fun. And I think there has been a real effort about focusing on like joy and love as well, like remembering that as a mutual aid group, like we are here because we are community, we do love each other, and that's where this work needs to come from, not from a like desire to grow or a desire to like achieve some sort of whatever measure of success you're looking at. Like we're successful as long as we're all still alive and still able to take care of one another. And I think that for me is the sort of like that's like the main lesson that we're constantly like relearning. And it's been an interesting one. I don't know, Nim, do you feel like I'm covering that okay?
Yeah, that's really cool. I agree with what you've said there. I think where you mentioned opportunities with being online, yes, there have been barriers, but when some doors are shutting, some doors are opening, and actually being online has increased access for some people, especially people with particular disabilities. One of the really cool things about MATE has been the approach of trying to make things accessible as possible. So I'm fairly dyslexic, and another mate can't do phone calls. And we came round with the hack that I leave them a voice note and they'd respond typing or in another way. And actually that was a really nice workaround, and these opportunities have come up, and there have been lots of individual conversations within MATE where people have felt that solidarity and less isolated, and we've worked to kind of meet each other where we are, and I think that has been a real opportunity. I also think it's quite radical in approach to accept varying capacity and to acknowledge, like, a lot of us have a lot going on surviving, and we do vary in energy and capacity and experience, and it's how to, the opportunities to value all of those and bring them forward to support each other, like Eddie was saying. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely, that's really, really interesting. Gemma, would you like to talk a bit about, you know, I suppose kind of continue on the conversation, if you will?
Yeah, sure. Can I just get a reminder about the question, if that's okay? Sure,
no worries. I was wondering what to give a reminder. The question was generally about kind of, you know, how during the pandemic, things like building trust have been especially difficult online and stuff like that. And it was about how we can expand grassroots organizations or union networks and things like that, and generally look out for each other, kind of outside of our own bubbles, when particularly like modern life is making us more and more isolated.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, the fundamentals of labor organizing is that you want to be talking with your co-workers about collective issues that you're experiencing inside the workplace. There's still a lot of workplaces that kind of maybe fall within like that sort of traditional method of sort of like labor organization, where, like, you know, there's maybe a couple of people in an office or a couple of people in a cafe or things. But furlough like really messed that up for a lot of sort of like I guess not, well, sort of changed that sort of dynamic a lot, where a lot of people were then working from home, like often in like quite isolated from their co-workers. And that was definitely like kind of a significant challenge that we saw, like with certain workplaces that we were already organizing in. A lot of in terms of kind of the organizing that sort of that's going on at the moment, the kind of the work that's been done to sort of like overcome that barrier, I guess, has been mostly about like recognizing that everyone's kind of like still experiencing this sort of like these conditions together, like, you know, the sort of the realities of like poor working conditions can still exist, like even if you're sort of like online, you know, you're working in your own home and things. And so like that has been something that we've been trying to facilitate between workers at the moment, is like hosting sort of meetings where people in similar industries are coming together and talking about their particular issues, and realizing like, oh hey, look, I'm still like, I'm not alone in experiencing this. There's like kind of a collective thing going on here. And that, like, for us at least, has been sort of like definitely like a really interesting opportunity, because we've been able to then do that with workplaces that like traditionally have been quite fragmented already. So, you know, particularly ones like care work, that has been often sort of like you might be the only sort of care worker that you know in this big company of like 2,000 people or something. But like being online has sort of like helped kind of connect people together a little bit easier than that. And I think the pandemic has really opened that as like an opportunity to sort of, I guess, organize more in those particular sectors. But I think, yeah, and now that kind of like things are like, at least furloughs kind of like sort of coming to an end, and you know, a lot more workers are being kind of, I guess, forced to go back into work again. Like we're seeing kind of a return of that sort of traditional, I guess, like form of organizing. So like you know, that it's been interesting, I guess, like kind of around these particular things.
Nim, are you wanting to jump in?
Like after as long as the IWWs finish what they need to say. Sorry, Gemma. And
no, it's fine.
I was just thinking about opportunities. We said about things becoming more polarized and victim blaming and stuff this year, but there's also been an increase in awareness of mutual aid, and sometimes in generosity and in solidarity. And like with our winter care packages, we put a general shout out, and the community was really generous. And it was actually, there were some really lovely things where people have donated supplies and nice things. And actually there's been things where it has been really positive as well. Like you say, sometimes people who haven't thought about mutual aid type things before becoming more aware and involved in it. Thank you. Sorry for jumping back in.
No, don't apologise. Thank you for adding that. Building on kind of what we were talking about before, with the way the pandemic has kind of exacerbated like already existing problems under, you know, the economic model system that we're living under, if you will. I'd kind of like to ask, like, how can we build solidarity between different communities and groups? For example, between Living Rent and Mate, or the IWW and Living Rent, like building off of what Eddie was saying, these problems are all kind of like interlinked, things like that. How can we avoid replicating the same marginalization of identities under capitalism within our own organizations? That's quite a big question. So apologies if it's too big, perhaps, but would someone from Living Rent like to go first?
Sure, I think we can both think about this and tackle it twofold. And I certainly think that, as we've already mentioned, that we're trying to build a more intersectional understanding of housing inequality within our organisation. People aren't just oppressed economically, but because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of their religious belief, their gender identity, their sexuality. And so we're really conscious about making sure that we are accountable to all of our members, and that it's not just the typical dominant voices within the working classes that are being heard. And we have we've developed really strict anti-discrimination policies against or to support our members, and also are very committed to tackling the spread of homelessness in queer and trans communities. What we've been trying to do is work to make sure that our meetings are chaired by people who can support our members and make sure that they are everyone feels comfortable in these spaces. And also, I think what Nim was discussing as well about having the space online and making sure that does actually improve accessibility for a lot of people that have commitments outside and can't always make it to a physical meeting or would be overwhelmed as so. And I think also a lot of this work is partially discursive as well, and constantly repeating the causes for marginalization in the housing system, and making sure that we are blaming the fact that housing is treated as a commodity rather than a fundamental human right, and that affects pretty much everyone, and keeping that discussion going and making sure that the focus is on that for everyone. Keita, do you want to jump in there as well?
So yeah, like on the point of political education, we kind of make sure that like people are kind of aware of like what is actually happening, because I'm with a lot of like the door knocking and the outreach stuff we do, we get quite a few tenants sort of blaming their situation on like migrants, and we just kind of make them aware that like there's powers like above them that are literally like meaning that everyone is suffering from it, you know, and that it isn't, they shouldn't just blame like a group of people, they should look at the bigger picture, and we kind of bring that up within our outreach as well.
Mate, either Eddie or Nim, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think I've got a few sort of like examples where we've done maybe oh sorry, there's my phone, you know, done sort of in solidarity actions or made gestures as such, and I hesitate to say that they are symbolic. I just want to kind of preface them with saying that they're not and they're not like the answer, they're part of it maybe. So when there were the sort of Black Lives Matters protests over the summer, one of the things that did do with that was sort of like extend our offer of support to anyone who attended. So to say, if you need to self-isolate following attending this event, like let us know and we'll do your shopping for you, or we'll provide this, what have you. And I think we were in touch with organizers as well to help provide like masks and hand sanitizer. And I think, yeah, so like recognizing the ways that all of our struggles are at their hearts, the same struggle, if you like. But to look at it, to kind of move away from those sort of happy stories, I'm thinking a lot about like when Gemma was mentioning like care workers in particular. So something that I've been aware of, and especially the way that mutual aid has maybe been misunderstood during the pandemic. And we've seen these sort of like mutual aid groups like burst into life and then quickly disintegrate. And there was like that app that they tried to introduce to like and I think what we have to be careful of is becoming part of the way that care and care work is undervalued, and the way that care workers are undervalued and exploited, and so at its heart, the way care isn't valued in our society, right? So like mutual aid is necessary, especially for communities and demographics that experience particular levels of oppression. And so it's important for us to like have mutual aid so that we can survive, right? But survival needs to also be a part of like trying to transform these systems. Like we're not a Band-Aid on something, because this clearly doesn't work. Like it should not be the case that we're raising money for a single mom who doesn't have furniture for her flat. Like that's not how this should be working. So we I think that in the Dean Spade book on mutual aid, there's something about how like it's a constant job to make sure that you're remaining in resistance to the status quo when you're doing your mutual aid. I realize I'm getting a bit rambly here, but there's something around doing the work that is essentially care, right? Like we're caring for one another, while being mindful that as a society, we do have responsibilities to one another, and there is infrastructure that is being systematically sort of like gutted, and a whole labor force that is being exploited. And those workers are often very marginalized, right? They're often migrant people, they're often working class people, often women. It's a very feminized, job as well, form of labor. So I think in terms of building like that solidarity and connecting our individual community movement, it's like recognizing the ramifications and the connections of what we're doing and what we're not doing, in the sort of broader spectrum. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit rambly. Nim, do you want to like?
No, I think that totally makes sense. One of the things that occurred to me as well was that I know that there are members of MATE who are also members of Living Rent, and probably also IWW, like they're not separate things, but it's how we, it's thinking about what opportunities that can bring up for like knowledge sharing across networks. Sorry, that's not really an answer, but that was what came into my head.
No worries, that's definitely an answer. It's absolutely true that there is a huge pool of shared membership between all these organizations. Gemma, would you like to add to that in terms of how we can avoid replicating the same kind of marginalization and issues with wider society in our own organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. Coming from like the labor world, like the labor organizing world, there is definitely like kind of marginalized identities are often pushed to the outside. Like you're often not at the center of power, like in these organizations or institutions. It's often you're in a caucus on the other side of like kind of the decision making table or something. And I think fundamentally it's about like often these large organizations just replicate existing problems in society. And I think it's really important to remember that kind of as any organization in the UK or you know, wherever you are, you're going to be replicating those kind of like quite unconsciously. So like, you know, it is like a constant active process to like sort of, I guess, expose that, and then kind of name it, and then say like, look, we don't want this to happen in this organization. So, you know, like our organization has like you know, safer spaces policies. We put like kind of affirmative action kind of like into place in the union as well. There's you know, like for me at least, like kind of if I want to see more people from marginalized identities get involved in the IWW, I want to be organizing where these marginalized people work, like, you know, fundamentally. You know, like I think you know, when we pick kind of like where we sort of like end up organizing, that will just kind of like bring in people who are traditionally involved in those industries. You know, if we primarily organize it in IT industries, we're probably just going to get like quite a lot of white men joining the organization, which is fine. You know, they deserve to be unionized, but like, you know, if that's what if we're wanting to kind of like build a broader kind of like, you know, more mass appealing kind of organization, we're going to want to sort of say that like we're relevant for everyone. You know, like we want like the lessons that we want to teach and the lessons that we want to kind of like see happen in real life are applicable to everyone, not just these kind of like, you know, particular set of people. So, you know, I think the IWW prides itself on trying to organize where other unions don't. You know, like when I first joined this organization, it was primarily with couriers, like courier workers, like people with working at Uber Eats and Deliveroo, who were primarily like kind of young people and like sort of migrant people, like working in Edinburgh, who were involved in this, and very rarely would they be involved in kind of like wider kind of like leftist politics. So, you know, like having, you know, like trying to organize and trying to support workers in that kind of environment, like, you know, I think it is a really important way to build sort of inclusion, I guess, like into any kind of organizations. Yeah, I think kind of like you know, it goes back to that thing about trust. It's like it, you know, like I fundamentally feel that kind of the biggest thing that holds back any organization is particularly like on the left, and particularly kind of within anarchist spheres of thinking, is that like you need to be talking to other people like all the time. Like you need to be talking about these issues, you need to be talking about this stuff with other people. Like, you know, do you have a problem at work? Yes. Okay, you talk about that problem at work and you try to do something about it with that person. I think sometimes it's quite easy to get sort of like trapped in our own thinking that like somehow kind of we can't translate these ideas into meaningful practice. And I think it's really easy to get sort of like lost in that sense of oh, there's no way that I can kind of like translate this sort of, you know, activist kind of like I guess mindset into something that, you know, this person who hasn't really involved themselves in leftist politics like would be able to like kind of handle or something. I don't know what it is, but like I often, you know, like what I found is that like, you know, if you can have a conversation with someone, that's like probably the most important kind of like step, like having and talking to people that maybe you wouldn't otherwise talk to. Like, you know, that's what I would say. Always talk to people. It's awkward, but like, you know, talk to people. It's really important.
Great, thanks for that, Gemma. Just to our audience, if you'd like to pop questions in the chat of the YouTube live stream, if we've got a bit of time at the end, we'll possibly be answering a few. But to go back, kind of continuing to focus on the kind of open discussion around lessons and things like that, kind of to pull a little bit on the mantra of kind of agitate, educate, organize. I wanted to ask a bit of a question of how have you found education in the last year? How has it kind of played into your kind of actions as an organization or mutual aid network? And in what ways has education been useful to you or a hindrance, depending on which the answer is, in the last year? Sorry, Living Rent, would you like to go first? Sorry, I've got to say that.
Sure, no worries. I think political education has always been something that's been really integral to the way that Living Rent works, because I mean, we've been organising since 2014, and since then have always been set out to change the dominant housing ideology, which is what prioritises housing as a means for profit rather than, you know, a place for shelter and a site of social reproduction. And we're always as we said, we're constantly, whenever we're speaking to people, we're trying to get them to understand that it's not their individual or cultural factors that are making their housing situation crappy. It's this system which prioritizes what value and what profit can be extracted from their homes. In the last year, and we've been receiving funding from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to hold regular training sessions, including ones that talk about, in particular, the housing landscape in Scotland, and how the work of living rent then sits in not wider class struggle and wider housing struggle and the history that living rent is now a really important part of. We've also recently started working with Glasgow Women's Library as well to understand how housing situations predominantly affect people that aren't white cisgender men and who bears the brunt of the housing crisis. So we're definitely expanding on this, and it's something that's been really useful for us and in sort of challenging the myths. So dismissing the myths that circulate about rent controls, for example, or the short-term let market. It's constantly producing and circulating counter-hegemonic knowledge, which has been really integral to the way we work alongside member defence. Well, it's part of member defence as well, and all of the things have to have that goal in mind, I think. Akita, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add there as well.
Just kind of reiterating how like our primary objective is changing the conversation about housing into more of like a human rights conversation where you have a right to have a roof over your head, and so people need to be held accountable to make sure that you do have a comfortable place to live, and that's I guess the biggest point we're trying to make politically.
Great, thanks for that. Nim, would you like to jump in there?
I only wanted to ask what hegemonic means, please.
Apologies, sorry for that. So it's just sorry, I'm in my free time I'm a postgrad, or not my free time, I'm a postgrad geographer, and I am constantly in loads of Marxist literature which saturates pretty much all of my life. So just the dominant housing ideology. So a hegemony is something that is like all encompassing and dominant. So sorry, it was just another word for that.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Thanks. It's always good to define our jargon. Sometimes it's easy to forget that not everyone knows what we're talking about. Nim or Eddie, would you like to talk a bit, just to kind of remind you on the question? It's about education, the way it's kind of played a role in what you're doing, whether it's been helpful, not helpful, etc.
I don't mind starting this one if that's all right. So all of our education so far has been informal information sharing resources and links, and person to person. At the moment, we're just starting to look at other way. I mean, sorry, I haven't been there right since the beginning, so please jump in, Eddie, if there was more organised education earlier, but we're just starting to look at joint education projects and how we can look at things together. We're currently reading Dean Spade and seeing if his ideas or their ideas are useful for MATE. But most of our education has been kind of informal and conversation based and via links and resources, I think. But Eddie, please jump in and say if there's other stuff as well.
No, I think that's fair to say. I think the political project of mutual aid hasn't necessarily been an explicit part of how we've been organizing from the start. I think it was more a response to so it is inherently political, but I don't think we were necessarily using that language when we were we're anticipating that our community, which is already vulnerable and isolated in many ways, is going to become more so, and we want to prepare for that as quickly as possible, right? But so there's been a lot of learning along the way, because people have we have a diverse range of experiences and backgrounds involved in organizing with us. So we're always learning from each other. There's some people who do have an activist background. There's quite a few of us who've worked in social care, for example. So Nim and I both have worked in social care. And that brings certain understandings about care, about processes, about procedures. And so we're always learning from each other about the best way to do things. We're always learning about, like, you know, safeguarding and holding that up against efficiency or what have you. And I think and because we're quite, as I said a while ago, like, because we're quite a porous group, and because, like, the capacity will change and the faces will change from month to month because of that, like, there's a struggle of how do we facilitate the, like, natural change that's going to happen while, like, holding on to our integrity as a group, and how do we put structures in place that enable everyone to participate, because that's really important for us, is that we are non-hierarchical or anti-hierarchical, if you like. Yeah, so I'm just rambling again, but yeah, I think we very much do learn from each other. And I think there's been quite a lot of people who come to this with the idea that, oh, it's like charity, it's like volunteering, like you go to your, like, you know, food bank and you hand out the food and then you go home and feel good about yourself. But I think actually, because what we do as a conversation, and we do in constant collaboration and communication with one another, that education and that radicalization, if you like, is happening quite organically, where we're having conversations about, like, no, we're not a charity because there's no eligibility threshold. There's no questions asked if someone comes to us and says they need a thing. I mean, as Nim said at the beginning, like, we might not be able to meet that need, but we're not going to refuse a need based off of any, like, you know, personal criteria or anything like that. We're not going to try to assess your need, because that's the model that we're, like, you know, inherently pushing back against. So I think that education is happening, but I think it's, as Nim said, it's very much person to person and, like, quite organic. And we are now trying to be a little bit more conscious about that. And there has been more, a more sort of, like, activist-y tone, if you like, in terms of trying to articulate the fact that we are amassing a form of power right now, and starting to think about, like, what and how can we do things with that? Like, how do we move a little bit beyond from survival without losing sight of the fact that we do want everyone to survive along the way?
Sure.
Great, thank you for that. Gemma, would you like to talk a bit about kind of the role of education last year within the IWW?
Yeah, it's absolutely fundamental, I think, to any organization that hopes to change anything in the world. I think you know, there's as Eddie was saying, like, about the kind of, I guess, some maybe misconceptions or some just not knowing kind of, like, you know, the options that are out there in terms of how to make change in the world. A lot of people, when they think of unions, they think of you know, like, these boardrooms where guys are, like, sitting there, like, arguing over a table, being like, oh yeah, this is how you change this contract, this is how you do this. And that's quite off-putting to a lot of people, especially on the ground floor. Like, you know, when when a worker comes forward and they explain to us, like, you know, they don't get their contract issued, right? Like, you know, like, how does that image, like, kind of unions in their head match up with the reality that they're wanting to change on the ground? And the IWW has a very strong kind of belief in sharing kind of the knowledge and tools of workplace organizing with every single worker. We don't believe in the idea that there's, like, a set organizer or, like, a set group of organizers within this organization. Like, every single one of our members has the potential to be an organizer in their workplace. And that kind of, like, decentralized model is, like, really, really important to kind of, like, be sort of, like, recognized here, because a lot of the issues that kind of exist within large scale unions is that, like, the decision making power gets removed from the people in the grassroots. You know, like, it gets shifted up and up and up and up in a way, you know, like, and there's laws in the UK that effectively make that their reality. Like, for trade unions, like, they're effectively illegal in the UK, like, you know, in terms of kind of, like, the actions that they can take. You know, wildcat strikes are basically illegal. You know, like, if you are an organized shop, you have to ask the permission of your regional secretary, like, to go on strike. So, like, some guy in London has to say, yes, this is the right thing to do, like, for a group of workers that, like, are in Inverness, like, who they've never met each other, right? You know, there's a lot of issues there. And I think that kind of, like, that can be solved by basically, like, fundamentally giving the tools of workplace organizing to the people on the shop floor. the IWW believes in solidarity unionism, which is not something that like kind of like strikes workers like initially as like something that they can do, but it happens all the time. Like, you know, like workers are constantly fighting and changing their conditions on the shop floor in organized groups, like not with any official union or anything happening. It's just like an organically kind of like appearing kind of like group of people, their friends in their workplace. Their boss does something shitty and then they fight back against it, right? You know, they're taking kind of like action against that, you know, boss in that situation to improve their conditions. That's the stuff that we really want to kind of like sort of encourage like our workers to like consider all the time. And so like we've got like a training program that we can sort of like support our workers with that's been honed over like 50-60 years. You know, we call it the OT 101. Like I'm sure anyone who's been in any IWW meeting like will have heard the reverence of the OT 101, but it's a very up to date and kind of like modern form of training. And that's like kind of something that like you know, the union like is really keen to put people through. It teaches people sort of like to start thinking in different ways about how to challenge kind of workplace issues. So, you know, fundamentally it gives you like kind of an idea of power in the workplace. You know, like power in the workplace is a zero-sum game. Like, you know, whatever your boss says, like if they have power you don't, like, right, how do you get it from them and give it back to you? That takes kind of like, you know, like natural, like a sort of, I guess, like kind of you know, people's first interaction with the workplace is usually to believe their boss when they say things, but then eventually they kind of like sort of like start twigging on the like, hey, my boss might actually be telling me like a crock of shit here. You know, and we sort of like bring that into the training, and it's like, actually, yes, you know, this is a tool that your boss is using to stop you from like kind of getting better things out of your workplace. And so like we sort of like make that education relevant by sort of like linking it back into kind of the individual's experience. So, you know, like our trainings, like they're about as accessible as we can try to make them. Like online has actually really helped with that. Like we're able to like sort of reach people further afield outside of cities, you know, people who like work all kinds of hours and might not be able to travel and things. And so like, yeah, fundamentally like education is absolutely everything, like I think in this, but it's also not like this formal thing as well that like kind of when we run a training, like it's daily, like, you know, like every single time that kind of like I'm having a conversation with someone, I'm trying to educate them about and also learning from them as well. Like it's a pedagogical thing. Like it's not just me just saying I'm the knowledgeable one because I barely know about anything outside of care work, right? So when somebody in the IT industry is like, this thing happened to me, and I'm like, that's fucking crazy. Like, you know, tell me about that. And like I'm trying to learn from them as much as they're trying to learn from me. And so like, yeah, I think like, you know, having this basis of like education and trying to create this reproductive like element to the union, like sort of in every single person that like kind of like, you know, comes through our doors, like is really, really key, because they'll become kind of the person inside their workplace who wants to like kind of then organize, and they might then become kind of maybe the person who, you know, maybe sort of has some of the answers to begin with and like encourages them. So we want to make sure that they feel comfortable doing that. So, you know, it's like constantly trying to replicate this union like sort of like inside as many workplaces as possible. Another thing, I guess, sorry, I love education in the union world. You know, there's a lot of people out there, like you mentioned the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and there, you know, there's people like big flying names like Jane McAlevey, who's doing all this stuff at the moment, like Organising for Power. You know, these 8,000 people, like, or I think it's like 40,000, I think it is actually now, like, you know, like Zoom calls and things like these things exist, but you know, like it can sometimes be a bit hard to kind of like connect to them from the outside. And so like unions often offer like kind of like a really important signposting bit. Like, you know, they'll be highlighting these kind of organizing opportunities going forward. And as well, like kind of in organizations like Living Rent and the IWW, we're democratic. So like if you recognize there's like a need for training or like a need for education, like it's relatively easy to source it, right? Like you can just say like, hey, I want this training like to happen, and because it's like a collectivized resource and money and stuff, yeah, you'll be able to get it. So I think it's really important. I love education.
Great, thank you for that, Gemma. Kisa, would you like to jump in? You've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of echo a point that Eddie made, and I think Gemma made as well, where I think a lot of the time there's this misconception that a union is a service. And so if you're having an issue in your workplace or in your home, you know, there's just people like legal-minded people who can come in and help you. And I think a lot of the time the people in power want that to be the narrative. They want it to be something that's within the confines of the law and within the bureaucratic system. But I think the beautiful thing about Living Rent and lots of other unions as well is the fact that like it's just regular tenants or workers just getting together and combining their skills to really make change happen, and then learning from each other as well. And I think that's something that we can't let die, basically, that sense of solidarity and mutual learning between each other.
Absolutely. Thank you for reiterating that point. It's really important to also address the kind of, you know, almost service expectation that's also kind of become quite prominent in the UK among a lot of people that join unions, and kind of almost the charity-like role that lots of organisations are kind of expected to perform just to keep people, you know, keep people's heads above water. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit out of time. I'd just like to ask if there are any resources or anywhere you would like to signpost people to before we sign off. So sorry to the people that ask questions. We are just slightly running out of time. We've got a lot to talk about. I realise I've been a bit unfair to Living Rent by not giving them any time to think by asking them all the questions first. So I'll go in reverse order and jump to Gemma. Is there any, just very quickly, anything you would like to share with the audience in terms of resources?
Yeah, my advice is if you've got a union inside your workplace, join it and get active. You know, fundamentally, you know, nothing's going to change until you get organized inside kind of your workplace, your community, whatever it is. And if you don't have one, then consider kind of joining one of a union like the IWW. You know, like we'd be really keen to support anyone and everyone in this. You know, not just because like of your own self-interest, but like because of the class interest as well in it. You know, it's extremely important to recognize that, like, you know, fundamentally unions and mutual aid organizations are about building class power, you know, to fight against capitalism. Like, you know, we need to get as many people on board as possible. And what I would suggest is, in terms of resources, is union websites. That's probably a good one.
Great, thank you. Eddie or Nim, is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess if you are queer and trans and you're in Edinburgh or around Edinburgh, you can get involved in MATE. You can reach us through our website or our various social media things. We also have a space within our sort of organizing space specifically for people of color as well, and which is something that we're trying to like make more space for and prioritize those voices. And if you're not in Edinburgh and you're not queer and trans, I guess the takeaway is to learn how to build the relationships where you can look after the people around you and you can say when you need something as well. That's been a big learning curve as well, is how do we all articulate the fact that we have needs and that we're not as an isolated individual responsible for meeting those needs on our own. Like, we have each other for a reason, and it's not only okay, it's good and wonderful to ask for help and receive help from those around you.
Enthusiastic flailing.
Brilliant, thank you. Keita and Meg, is there something you'd like to share resource-wise, anything like that?
I guess just if you are in Edinburgh and you are experiencing a problem with your landlord or your housing association or your council, you're not alone, and you know there's a bunch of tenants behind you to work together to create the outcome you need and deserve. And I'll let Meg add to that.
Just to say that, yeah, you all deserve better in your housing situation. So I put it, the way that gets better is that you need to join your union and you need to get involved and take control of the housing situation, and you do that with an army of tenants behind you. So you can do that by going to our website, www.livingrent.org/join, if you want to join a renter. If you're not a tenant, you can still give us money, and that's the same link, and you can become a supporter as well, and that's always welcome too. But thank you for listening to us.
Great, thank you so much for coming along and speaking on this panel today. And just to our audience, just to remind everyone, this year all of our donations go directly to our speakers and organisations. The PayPal should be in the top of the chat on the YouTube comments in the live stream. If you are able to donate, that would be brilliant. And thank you once again to our speakers for generously donating their time today and giving us lots of food for thought to take away and kind of implement into our own lives and our own organising. And yeah, moving forward both in and out of the pandemic. Thank you so much. We can stop the stream now.